I woke up to the strangest sensation, something soft and warm brushing against my skin, so faint that for a moment I thought I was still dreaming, but then I felt it again, unmistakable this time, a whisper of lips against the curve of my neck. My breath caught in my throat and my entire body froze as my brain tried to catch up with what was happening. Someone was in my room. I wasn't alone. A wave of heat rushed through me, followed by a chill that pricked every inch of my skin. My fingers gripped the edge of the blanket as I listened, heart pounding so loudly I thought whoever was there could hear it too. Then just as quickly as it had come, the presence disappeared, slipping away like a shadow. The air shifted and I heard it, the quietest sound, barely more than a sigh, the door closing. My pulse skyrocketed. Every instinct screamed at me to move, to do something, but I sat frozen in place, breath shallow, straining my ears for any other noise. The house was silent. Too silent. I reached blindly for my phone, my fingers fumbling against the screen, the dim glow of it barely enough to cast light beyond my hands. I turned my head slowly, scanning the room, but there was nothing. Just my own ragged reflection in the mirror across the room, eyes wide, lips parted, chest rising and falling in uneven breaths. I wasn't imagining it. The warmth still lingered on my skin. I swallowed hard and swung my legs over the bed, pressing my bare feet against the cool wooden floor, grounding myself in reality. My body trembled as I stood, my mind racing with questions I wasn't ready to answer. Who? Why? How long had they been there? I crept toward the door, reaching out, fingers hesitating over the handle before twisting it. The hallway stretched before me, empty and dimly lit by the soft glow of the moon filtering through the windows. My eyes darted toward the end of the corridor, toward his room. My uncle's door was closed, just as it had been before I went to bed. My stomach twisted. I had arrived at the lake house just hours ago, excited for a quiet summer away from the noise of the city, away from my thoughts, away from everything. Now I felt like I had stepped into something I didn't understand, something I wasn't supposed to. I exhaled shakily, forcing my limbs to move, walking silently back to my bed, but sleep was impossible. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, replaying the moment in my head over and over. The warmth, the weight of the presence, the ghost of that touch still burning against my skin. The memories of the evening before flickered behind my eyes, searching for something, anything, that might explain what just happened. I had been with him all day, catching up on years we had lost, laughing over dinner, sipping wine on the deck as the sun dipped below the water. He had smiled, easy and unbothered, the same way he always had. But now I couldn't stop wondering if I had missed something in his eyes, some hint, some moment where a line had blurred without me realizing it. My throat felt tight. I pressed my palm against my neck as if that could erase the sensation. I told myself I was imagining things. It could have been nothing. A dream. The wine messing with my head. A trick of my own restless mind. But deep down I knew the truth. I had felt it. Unmistakable. And no matter how hard I tried to push it away, I knew it was only the beginning. The next morning, the house was quiet except for the faint sound of birds outside and the occasional creak of the wooden floorboards as Jonathan moved around. I stayed in bed longer than usual, hoping the extra minutes would somehow erase the memories of last night, but they clung to me like a second skin, impossible to ignore. The moment I stepped into the kitchen, he was already there, casually leaning against the counter, stirring his coffee like nothing had happened. My pulse quickened. He looked the same as always, relaxed, effortlessly put together, his hair slightly tousled, his shirt fitting a little too well against his frame. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was different, that beneath his easy demeanor, there was something else lurking. I told myself I was imagining it, but then he looked up, his gaze meeting mine across the small space, and for a second I swore I saw it, just the briefest flicker of hesitation before he smiled. "Morning," he said, his voice smooth, unaffected. I nodded, forcing myself to act normal, to push away the thoughts circling in my head like vultures. But as I sat down with my coffee, I found myself watching him, watching the way he moved, the way his fingers wrapped around the cup, the way his eyes occasionally darted toward me when he thought I wasn't paying attention. The tension in my chest tightened. Maybe I wasn't imagining things after all. The heat outside was unbearable by noon, and when he suggested going down to the lake, I agreed without thinking, desperate for a distraction. The water was colder than I expected, sending a jolt through me as I dove beneath the surface, but it was refreshing, a temporary escape. He swam ahead, effortlessly cutting through the water, and for a moment, it was easy to pretend everything was normal, that we were just two people enjoying a summer afternoon. But then I tried to climb onto the dock, my hands slipping against the wet wood, and before I could steady myself, his hands were on me. Strong. Steady. Holding me firmly at the waist. A sharp intake of breath got caught in my throat as his grip lingered just a little too long, his fingers pressing into my skin, his body close enough that I could feel the warmth radiating from him despite the cool water. My heart pounded so hard I thought he might hear it. And then, just as smoothly as he had grabbed me, he let go, stepping back like nothing had happened. But something had. I felt it. And judging by the way he hesitated before turning away, so did he. The moment passed, but it left a crack in the careful wall I was trying to build between us. I thought about it all through dinner prep, the way his touch had sent a shiver through me, the way I had wanted to lean into it instead of pull away. I was slicing vegetables when he reached past me for something on the counter, his fingers brushing against mine, barely a touch, just a whisper of skin against skin, but it sent a current through me so strong I had to grip the knife tighter to steady myself. He didn't pull away immediately. I didn't either. The space between us was too small, charged with something I couldn't name. Then, as if nothing had happened, he grabbed what he needed and stepped back, leaving me standing there with my pulse hammering and my hands trembling slightly. I avoided his eyes during dinner. I needed air, space, something to break the hold he seemed to have on me, so I stayed outside after we ate, settling onto the porch swing with a glass of wine, hoping the night breeze would clear my head. But then I heard the door creak open behind me, followed by slow, deliberate footsteps. He sat down beside me, close enough that his knee brushed against mine, a bottle of whiskey dangling from his fingers. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked, his voice low, rough around the edges. I shook my head, unable to find words, because right then, with the darkness surrounding us, with the quiet hum of crickets in the distance, with the warmth of his body just inches away, I realized something I wasn't ready to admit. This wasn't just in my head. And I wasn't sure I wanted it to stop. The whiskey burned warm and slow as it slid down my throat, mixing with the summer air, thick and heavy, wrapping around us like a blanket we couldn't escape. The porch was quiet except for the occasional creak of the swing and the distant sound of the lake lapping against the shore. But between us, something else was building, something neither of us wanted to name. Jonathan took another sip, his fingers drumming absently against the glass, his head tilted back slightly as he let out a low chuckle at something I had said, something about the time I had gotten lost in the woods when I was younger and how he had been the one to find me, dragging me back to the house with twigs in my hair and tears in my eyes. I laughed too, the sound spilling out too easily, too freely, but then I bit down on my lower lip without thinking, a nervous habit, an unconscious reaction, and suddenly the energy between us shifted. His laughter faded, his fingers tightening around the glass, his gaze dropping, lingering on my mouth just long enough to make my breath catch. I felt it like a slow pull, a tension so thick I could barely swallow past it, but I forced myself to keep talking, to fill the silence before it swallowed us whole. I said something about how he had always taken care of me, how he had always been the one I ran to, how he had felt more like my protector than anyone else in my life ever had, and I meant it as something light, something innocent, but the second the words were out, his expression changed. His jaw clenched, his eyes darkened, and then he smirked, but it wasn't the same easy, playful smirk I had seen 1,000 times before. It was something sharper, something edged with a thought he wasn't saying out loud. "You're not that little girl anymore," he murmured, his voice lower now, rougher, and my stomach flipped, my fingers curling instinctively around my own glass as if that would ground me. A pause stretched between us, too long, too heavy, a moment we should have broken but didn't. I looked at him, really looked at him, and he was already looking at me, his eyes unreadable, his fingers still wrapped around his drink but no longer moving, as if he had frozen in place, as if he had just realized something he couldn't take back. My pulse pounded so loudly in my ears I almost didn't hear my own breath hitch when he shifted slightly, when his knee brushed against mine again, this time deliberately, this time without any attempt to move away. And then, without thinking, without deciding, without even knowing who moved first, our lips met. It was fleeting, barely more than a whisper of contact, just the softest press of skin against skin, but the moment it happened, everything inside me ignited at once, a rush of heat and adrenaline so fast I couldn't process it. I should have pulled away. I should have stopped it. But I didn't. Neither did he. Instead, the kiss deepened, slow at first, hesitant, like we were testing something neither of us had meant to find, but then his hand was on my jaw, tilting my face up to his, his fingers pressing just enough to make me feel it, just enough to make my lips part beneath his, and then it wasn't slow anymore. It was heat. It was fire. It was everything I hadn't let myself think about until now, everything I had tried to ignore, everything that had been simmering beneath the surface for days, weeks, maybe even years. His breath was warm against my skin, his fingers sliding into my hair, his body angled just enough that I could feel the weight of him, the solidness of him, and my entire world narrowed down to this moment, this impossible, irreversible moment. And then, just as suddenly as it started, it ended. He pulled back first, sharp and abrupt, his breath uneven, his eyes wide like he had just woken up from a dream he hadn't meant to have. A muscle in his jaw twitched, his hands flexing like he didn't know what to do with them, and for a second I thought he might say something, might try to explain, might try to take it back. But he didn't. He just stood up. Without a word, without a glance, without anything but the sound of his footsteps fading into the house, leaving me sitting there alone, heart racing, lips tingling, head spinning, trying to understand what had just happened, trying to convince myself that I hadn't just crossed a line I could never uncross. The morning air was thick with humidity, the kind that clung to your skin and made the air feel heavier than it should, but the real weight pressing down on me had nothing to do with the weather. The moment I stepped into the kitchen, I felt it, an unspoken shift, an invisible wall that hadn't been there before, a coldness that settled between us like a line drawn in the sand. Jonathan was already there, moving around with practiced ease, pouring his coffee, flipping through the newspaper, acting as if last night hadn't happened, as if nothing had changed, but everything had. I could still feel it, the ghost of his touch, the lingering heat of his breath against my skin, the way his hands had curled into my hair like he was memorizing the shape of me. My stomach tightened as I watched him, waiting for him to say something, to acknowledge it, to at least glance in my direction, but he didn't. He just sipped his coffee, his expression unreadable, his movements controlled, deliberate, distant. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to move, to pretend like I wasn't unraveling from the inside out, but my hands trembled slightly as I reached for a mug, the simple act of pouring coffee feeling impossibly difficult when the air between us was so thick with tension I could barely breathe. "Morning," I said, my voice quieter than I intended, but the only response I got was a nod, barely a flicker of acknowledgement before he turned back to the paper, his jaw tight, his fingers drumming absently against the table like he was counting down the seconds until he could leave the room. The knot in my stomach twisted tighter. He was avoiding me. Not just avoiding eye contact, not just avoiding conversation. Avoiding me entirely, like if he kept moving, if he kept himself busy, he wouldn't have to face what had happened, wouldn't have to face me. The realization hit harder than I expected, sharp and stinging, but I forced myself to push it down, to keep drinking my coffee like I wasn't coming apart piece by piece. The rest of the morning passed in the same unbearable silence, the hours stretching long and slow, filled only with the occasional sound of him moving around the house, finding things to do, keeping himself occupied with tasks that didn't need doing. I told myself I wouldn't let it bother me, that I wouldn't let him control the way I felt, but it was impossible not to notice the way he spoke less, the way his voice had lost its warmth, the way he didn't even look at me unless he had to. The distance between us wasn't just physical. It was something else, something deeper, something I didn't know how to fix. By the time the sun started sinking below the trees, I couldn't take it anymore. I found him outside, leaning against the railing of the porch, his gaze fixed on the lake like it held the answers to a question he hadn't even asked yet. I hesitated, but then I stepped forward, my heart pounding as I forced the words out before I could second-guess myself. "Are we gonna talk about it?" His shoulders tensed just for a second, just long enough for me to know he had heard me, but he didn't turn around. "Talk about what?" The words were too casual, too controlled, like he had rehearsed them in his head before saying them out loud. My throat tightened. "You know what?" I said, softer this time, but he just shook his head, exhaling slowly, running a hand through his hair before finally looking at me, and for the first time all day I saw it. The hesitation, the regret, the conflict twisting beneath his skin. "It was a mistake," he said, and I felt the words like a punch to the gut, sharp and cruel and final. I opened my mouth, ready to argue, ready to tell him he was lying, that he had felt it just as much as I had, but he was already turning away, already putting another wall between us, and all I could do was stand there, the night stretching long and cold around us, swallowing whatever words I had left. I wasn't looking for it. I wasn't thinking about it. I was just scrolling mindlessly, flipping through old pictures on my phone while lying on my bed, trying to distract myself from the silence stretching through the house. And then I saw it. A blurred reflection in the glass of the porch door, captured by accident, nothing intentional, nothing posed, but it made my breath catch so sharply in my throat I nearly dropped the phone. It was us. Me and Jonathan. Too close. Too intimate. The angle was off, slightly distorted by the glass, but it was unmistakable. The way I was leaning toward him, the way his hand rested against my knee, the way his face was turned just slightly toward mine like he had been about to close the distance. My stomach twisted. I didn't remember taking it. I didn't remember even holding my phone in that moment. It must have been an accident, some careless swipe of my finger, an unconscious movement, but none of that mattered. What mattered was that it was real, that it had happened, that there was no way to pretend otherwise. My hands trembled as I hovered over the delete button, my finger poised, ready to erase it, to make it disappear like none of it had ever happened, but I didn't press it. I couldn't. Something inside me resisted, something deep and instinctual, something that refused to let go of the proof that I wasn't imagining things, that the pull between us wasn't just in my head. I locked the screen instead, shoving the phone under my pillow as if that could somehow make it disappear from my thoughts. But the image was burned into my brain now, impossible to forget, impossible to unsee. I tried to shake it off, tried to go about my day like normal, but nothing felt normal anymore. The walls of the house felt smaller, the space between me and Jonathan more fragile, like it was stretched too thin, ready to snap. I needed to breathe, needed to move, needed something to pull me out of my own head, so I went to his room, rummaging through the closet until I found one of his shirts, slipping it on without thinking, letting the fabric swallow me whole, letting the scent of him wrap around me like a second skin. It was stupid, childish even, but it made me feel better, made me feel grounded, like I could pretend for just a little while that things weren't unraveling at the seams. I was standing in front of the mirror, brushing my fingers absently over the buttons, when I heard the door open behind me. I turned too fast, heart leaping into my throat, and there he was, standing in the doorway, his expression unreadable, his eyes flicking over me in a way that made my skin prickle. A long silence stretched between us, heavy and thick, neither of us moving, neither of us speaking. His jaw tensed. His fingers curled at his sides. He didn't ask why I was wearing it. He didn't need to. We both knew. But he didn't say anything either. He just stood there, eyes dark, lips pressed together, his body radiating an energy I couldn't decipher, and then without a word he turned and walked away, leaving me standing there, pulse hammering, stomach twisting, the weight of his silence louder than anything he could have said. The silence between us had turned into something alive, something thick and unbearable, something that followed us through every room, stretching across every second of every hour, growing heavier with each passing day. We barely spoke. We barely looked at each other. But it was there, pressing down on us, coiling around us like a wire pulled too tight, ready to snap. I felt it every time I passed him in the hallway, every time his presence filled a space before I even saw him, every time I caught him watching me when he thought I wouldn't notice. It wasn't avoidance. It was restraint. A battle neither of us was winning. The storm started just after sundown, the sky turning an unnatural shade of gray, thunder rolling in slow and deep, rattling the windows, the first fat drops of rain smacking against the porch like a warning. I stayed in the living room, curled up in the corner of the couch, pretending to read, pretending I wasn't waiting, pretending I didn't know he was in the next room doing the exact same thing. Then the power flickered. Once, twice. And then everything went black. My breath caught. The storm raged outside, wind howling through the trees, rain hammering against the roof in thick sheets, the only light coming from the occasional flash of lightning, slicing through the dark just long enough to illuminate the space around me. I heard him before I saw him, the sound of his footsteps, slow and steady, moving toward me until the next burst of light revealed him standing at the edge of the room. The air between us crackled. And then he moved closer. A brush of skin against skin, the barest touch, the smallest contact, but it sent a current straight through me, stealing my breath, setting every nerve on fire. I didn't pull away. I couldn't. His fingers curled lightly around mine, hesitant, unsure, but they're real, undeniable, impossible to ignore. His voice was barely more than a whisper, rough and quiet, laced with something I couldn't name. You know we shouldn't. But he didn't move away. Neither did I. And then his fingers traced higher, up my arm, over my shoulder, the warmth of his breath against my skin, the moment stretching so thin I thought I might break beneath it. And then he kissed me. And this time neither of us stopped. I woke up before I even opened my eyes, before my brain fully caught up to my body, before I could process where I was or why the sheets felt different beneath my skin. The air was thick, warm, heavy with something unspoken, and then I felt it. The slow, steady rise and fall of breath beside me, the weight of an arm draped loosely over my waist, the unmistakable heat of another body pressed against mine. My stomach twisted, my pulse hammered, and reality crashed over me in a single crushing wave. Jonathan. Last night. The storm. His hands. His mouth. No more hesitation, no more restraint, no more pretending we could keep fighting what had been building between us for days, weeks, maybe longer. My heart slammed against my ribs as I shifted, careful, barely breathing, afraid to wake him, afraid to face what came next. But then he moved too, a slow inhale, a tightening of his grip, the way his fingers flexed against my skin like he wasn't ready to let go. My chest ached. I wanted to stay in this moment, wanted to freeze time before reality could sink its claws into us, before we had to acknowledge what we had done, what we couldn't undo. But then he exhaled, slow and heavy, his breath warm against my shoulder, and I felt it before I even heard the words. Regret. This was a mistake, he murmured, and even though I knew it was coming, even though I had braced for it, the words still hit like a punch to the gut. I didn't move. Didn't speak. Just stared at the ceiling, my throat tightening, my mind scrambling for something to say, something that wouldn't sound desperate or naive or foolish. But then I turned my head and our eyes met, and suddenly I couldn't breathe for an entirely different reason. Because his words were one thing, but his expression was another, his gaze betraying him in a way his voice never would. It wasn't a mistake. We both knew it. But admitting that meant facing it, meant dealing with it, meant acknowledging that there was no going back, and neither of us was ready for that. So I swallowed the lump in my throat, forced my voice to stay steady, forced the lie out even though it burned on the way up. Yeah, I said barely above a whisper. It was. He nodded once, quick, sharp, as if saying it out loud made it true, as if we could will it into something that had never happened just by agreeing on it. The silence stretched, thick and unbearable, and then he pushed himself up, rubbing a hand down his face, exhaling like he could physically force the weight off his chest. We forget it, he said, more to himself than to me. It stays here. I nodded, pretending like it didn't hurt, pretending like I wasn't already losing him, pretending like I hadn't just realized the most dangerous truth of all. I was in love with him. And it was already too late. I heard the car before I saw it, the low hum of an engine rolling up the gravel driveway, the crunch of tires against stone, the slam of a door. My stomach clenched, my body went rigid, my mind screamed at me to move, but I stayed frozen on the couch, gripping the book in my lap as if I could disappear into it, as if I could pretend that what was happening wasn't real. But it was. Sophie was here. Early. Unannounced. And Jonathan hadn't told me she was coming. My pulse pounded as I heard voices outside, hers light and warm, his lower, tense, a sharp contrast to the way he had always sounded with her before. I wasn't imagining it. Something in his tone had changed. I stayed where I was, forcing slow, even breaths as the front door swung open, as footsteps echoed through the house, as the weight of her presence filled the space like an undeniable force. And then she was there, standing in the doorway, a bright smile on her face, her eyes sweeping the room before landing on me. Ava, she said, too cheerful, too smooth, like she had already decided something was off but hadn't quite figured out what. I forced a smile, hoping she didn't see the way my fingers dug into the book, hoping she didn't hear the slight hitch in my breath when Jonathan stepped in behind her, his eyes flicking to mine for the briefest second before looking away. He was tense. I could see it in the way his jaw tightened, the way his shoulders were stiff, the way he kept his distance like I was something dangerous. He hadn't been like this before. Not with her. Not with me. Not until now. Didn't know you'd be here so soon, I said, somehow managing to keep my voice steady, even as my heart slammed against my ribs. I wanted to surprise him, she said, tilting her head, studying me like I was a puzzle she couldn't quite solve. Guess I did. I swallowed hard, nodding, keeping my expression neutral, but the weight of her stare burned through me. Jonathan moved past us without a word, disappearing into the kitchen, and for a second Sophie just watched him, something flickering behind her eyes before she turned back to me. You've gotten close with him, haven't you? The words hit harder than they should have, not because of what she said but because of the way she said it. Casual like an afterthought but too precise, too carefully placed, like she was testing the waters, waiting to see how I would react. I forced a laugh, shaking my head, pretending like I didn't feel the blood draining from my face. He's family, I said, but it didn't sound convincing, not even to me. She smiled, slow and knowing, like she wasn't buying it, like she already had her answer. And in that moment I knew. She suspected something. She just didn't know what yet. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet that felt wrong, too still, too charged, like something was waiting to happen. Sophie was in the living room, scrolling through her phone. Jonathan had just stepped into the shower and I was in the kitchen, pretending to clean but really just trying to keep my hands busy, trying to ignore the way my stomach twisted every time she looked at me for too long. My skin felt too tight, my thoughts too loud, and I needed to get out, needed air, needed space, but then I heard it. A shift in the silence, the absence of movement, a pause that stretched too long. I turned my head just in time to see Sophie standing in the hallway, Jonathan's phone in her hand, her face pale, her lips slightly parted, her fingers tightening around the device like she had just found something she wasn't supposed to see. My breath caught. My pulse slammed into my throat. She didn't say a word. He didn't need to. I already knew. He saw it. The picture. The single moment we hadn't erased. The evidence of something we had both tried to pretend wasn't real but had never been able to deny. She stared at the screen for what felt like forever, then slowly, mechanically she locked the phone, set it down on the table and walked out. No words. No accusations. No screams or questions. Just the sound of the front door swinging open, the sharp clap of it shutting behind her, and then silence. A silence that was louder than any confrontation could have been. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. My legs felt weak, my hands cold, my body locked in place as the weight of what had just happened came crashing down on me in full force. And then the bathroom door slammed open. Heavy footsteps. The sound of someone moving too fast, too recklessly, a presence charging straight toward me before I even had a chance to process it. Jonathan. His hair was still damp, his shirt half-buttoned, his chest rising and falling with uneven breaths, his expression sharp, eyes burning as they locked onto mine. You told her. The accusation cut through the air like a knife, sharp, direct, full of something that sounded too close to panic. My lips parted but no sound came out. I shook my head, stepping back, trying to make sense of the way everything had just spiraled so fast, so suddenly, but I didn't need to say anything. His gaze dropped to the table, to the phone she had left behind, and his entire body went rigid. He exhaled sharply, fingers curling into fists, jaw tightening so hard I thought it might break. And just like that, it was over. The pretending. The hiding. The thin, fragile barrier we had tried to build between us had just shattered completely. There was no going back now. The house was no longer quiet. The moment Sophie left, everything unraveled at a speed I couldn't control, couldn't slow down, couldn't stop no matter how much I wanted to. Jonathan went after her, calling her name, his voice tight, sharp, filled with something close to desperation, but she didn't stop, didn't even look back, just kept walking down the driveway until she reached her car, yanking the door open with a force that made my stomach twist. I watched from the window, frozen in place as he caught up to her, his hands moving as he spoke, as he tried to explain, but it was too late. I couldn't hear their words, but I saw the moment she said something that made him flinch, saw the way his shoulders stiffened, the way his fingers curled at his sides, saw the way her face crumpled before she turned away, slamming the door shut and driving off without another word. I felt sick. Jonathan stood there long after her car disappeared, his body tense, his hands in his hair, exhaling a breath so heavy it made his entire frame sink. I should have gone to him. I should have said something. But what was there to say? We had done this. We had destroyed something that could never be fixed. He turned and walked back toward the house, and I knew before he even stepped inside that it was over. He didn't look at me as he passed, didn't acknowledge me at all, just went straight upstairs, and I didn't follow. I couldn't. The next few hours blurred together. I barely remember packing, barely remember hearing my phone buzz over and over, messages from my mother, from people who weren't supposed to know, from people who suddenly did. My hands shook as I read them, as I saw her words, the anger bleeding through every letter, every punctuation mark, demanding to know if it was true, demanding to know how I could do something like this, demanding to know what kind of person I had become. I didn't answer. I just kept throwing my things into my suitcase, stuffing clothes into empty spaces, my breath shallow, my chest tight, my vision blurry, knowing I couldn't stay, knowing there was nothing left for me here. I heard Jonathan's footsteps before I saw him, but this time he stopped at the door, leaning against the frame, watching me pack without saying a word. I waited for him to stop me. Waited for him to tell me to stay. Waited for him to tell me anything that would make this hurt less. But he didn't. He just stood there, silent, unreadable, hands in his pockets, like he had already decided this was the way it had to be. So this is it? I finally asked, my voice barely above a whisper, my hands tightening around the zipper of my bag. He exhaled through his nose, staring at the floor for a moment before meeting my gaze. What else is there? And that was it. That was the answer. I grabbed my bag, walked past him, walked down the stairs, walked out the door, walked until I was in the backseat of the cab, gripping my phone so tightly my knuckles turned white, watching the house get smaller and smaller through the window, watching him disappear from view, feeling something inside me crack wide open. The train ride was quiet, just the low hum of the tracks beneath me, just the soft vibration of my phone in my hands, just the weight of everything pressing down on my chest like a stone. I stared at the screen, at the last message he had sent, at the words staring back at me, burning into my mind, carving themselves into my ribs like something permanent, something I'd never be able to erase. You know that I still love you. I inhaled sharply, my thumb hovering over the screen, my heart hammering, my eyes stinging, my body screaming for me to respond, to say something, to hold on to whatever this was for just a little longer. But I didn't. I just turned the phone off, placed it face down on the empty seat beside me, and stared out the window as the train carried me away from him, away from everything, knowing I would never be the same.